Tropical coral reefs are spectacular, diverse ecosystems. But are they, as suggested in a paper published 10 years ago, on the slippery slope to slime? Much simpler ecosystems dominated by seaweeds. Even before the impacts of a changing climate started to have their effects on coral reefs, they were in trouble due to overexploitation, overfishing, pollution, and changing land use practices. Now we have added climate change as a stressor to coral reefs. Why should we care about coral reefs anyway? Beyond their clear aesthetic values, they are hotspots of biodiversity, but they actually support over 500 million people worldwide, and about 30 million people depend entirely on coral reefs because they actually live on them. They occupy only a small part of the global oceans, less than 0.5%. Yet it's been estimated that their value for tourism and recreation is just under $10 billion US per year and nearly $6 billion US in terms of fisheries. At the heart of tropical coral reefs is a very special relationship between the coral animal and single-celled algae or plants that live within the coral tissue. And it's actually the pigments in the algae that give corals their many and varied colors. For the coral, it gains extra energy, and this allows them to grow fast enough to withstand biological and physical erosion. The algae get protection from being in the coral tissue. These two organisms together form the fantastic structures that we see on present-day coral reefs. The biodiversity of coral reefs is overwhelming. The complex structures of coral reefs provide home, habitat, food for many thousands of associated organisms. We are still discovering new species on coral reefs, but on our present trajectory of global warming, we might not know what we've got till it's actually gone. Now, coral reefs are found in the warmest parts of the tropical oceans, in shallow, well-lit, clear, low-nutrient, low-sediment waters. As with many tropical plants and animals, this makes them much more vulnerable to warming oceans. This is most clearly evident in coral bleaching event. Coral bleaching is when the special relationship between the coral and the algae breaks down. This happens under stress, which can be high temperature, low salinity waters, or pollution. As a result of bleaching, the corals may die. What is happening recently is the occurrence of widespread bleaching throughout the world. This has been clearly linked to unusually warm water temperatures for the coral reefs. When coral reefs bleach, it doesn't only affect the corals, it affects the reef-associated organisms. One study, for example, looked at the fish on a reef after it had bleached. Although only about 10% of the fish actually relied on the corals, 75% showed a decline in numbers. This clearly has consequences as we're going into a warmer and warmer world. Another key issue for corals is ocean acidification. This is happening because of the extra carbon dioxide we have put into the atmosphere has actually been absorbed by the oceans. But this has severe consequences for corals maintaining their calcification rates. There is a natural laboratory where we can time travel into the future as to what ocean acidification could do to coral reefs. Scientists at Ames have been studying a natural coral reef system at Milne Bay in Papua New Guinea. Here, due to geological processes, carbon dioxide bubbles up from the sea floor, and you can go from a coral reef with normal oceanic pH to one with levels of pH expected by the end of this century. What you see is a change from a diverse, complex ecosystem to one which is dominated by a single massive coral species. An additional source of physical destruction to coral reef ecosystems is by the big storms, the tropical cyclones, hurricanes, and typhoons. Now, these occur naturally, and coral reefs can recover given time, but it takes about 10 to 20 years. What we're looking at as we continue in the warming world is that although the frequency of these big storms might not change, those that do occur are likely to be more intense. Tropical seawater temperatures are warming at about 70% of the rate of global average temperatures. So we know that global temperatures have warmed about 0.7 to 0.8 degrees. This seems an incredibly small amount of warming, but it is significant. It has changed the baseline temperatures. It is increasing thermal stress events to coral reefs, and we've already seen the consequences. 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is the maximum at which we can sustain coral reefs as they are at present. By the time you reach 450 parts per million, less than 10% of coral reefs, as we know them, will survive. And by 550 parts, the end of this century, it seems very unlikely that coral reefs could survive. This will be significant for these ecosystems. They're not going to disappear entirely. There will be some organisms, in particular seaweeds, which will take advantage of the new situation, and maybe a few hardy coral species. What we will lose is the incredible biodiversity of these ecosystems. And this has direct flow-on effects to the currently 500 million people who rely on healthy coral reefs for their livelihoods and incomes. So what can we do to save the world's coral reefs? We have to now act globally in order to halt and reverse the increasing amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We can also take actions locally. Coral reefs in unpolluted, undisturbed waters, where they're not overexploited, are actually more resilient to climate and environmental stresses. So we can look after our reefs a lot better than we have been doing in many parts of the world already. But this is only going to buy a small amount of time if we continue along the current trajectory towards a 4-degree world by the end of this century.